You might have noticed that everything we have covered in detail in this course goes up until about the 1990s, the latest. So you might be wondering what has happened in literary theory in the last 20 to 30 years. In the 1990s, there started to be a strong sense that theory was over, and many books were published with some version of the phrase after theory in the title. I'm going to start this video with an overview of what exactly after theory means, drawn from Peter Berry's textbook Beginning Theory, from which your chapter on eco-criticism for this week was drawn. Then I'm going to do a quick overview of some recent approaches to literary criticism. To start with, the phrase after theory is a little misleading. It's not that theory isn't taught anymore, obviously, or useful, or influential. As Berry puts it, theory is no longer newsworthy. Many of the striking observations of the theories we have been studying have become academic commonplaces, while the focus on theory has come to seem a bit damaging to some literary critics. Berry lists 4 primary ideas that are commonplace today that grew out of the literary theory of the 1960s to 1990s. First, the idea that identity is not fixed. We particularly discussed this when we discussed feminism, and I defined the idea of constructivist as opposed to essentialist identities, but this applies to other identity categories as well: racial, religious, national, etc. Today there is very little academic disagreement, and increasingly social agreement, that identity is constructed socially. Second, the idea that literary texts are unstable. As with individual identity, a text's identity is socially constructed and not inherent in the text. While various critics might disagree about the extent to which an appropriation of the text is fair, the idea that readers and audiences use texts for their own purposes rather than finding a meaning that was always there in the text is largely taken as a given now. Third, language itself is unstable. Freudian psychology and deconstruction made huge waves in the 1960s and 1970s with the claims that language means things that go beyond our control or intentions, resulting in melodramatic phrases like the death of the author, because what the author thought the text meant didn't matter anymore. But again, this is largely accepted today. Finally, every reading approach is a theory. In other words, it's not possible to be neutral. Just saying you read objectively, as the new critics tried to, is itself a theoretical position with social and political consequences. So what has changed? Again, Berry gives us a list of features of theory that more recent critics have been moving away from. Increasingly, arguments are expected to be demonstrated with empirical evidence rather than broad speculative claims. There has also been a weakening of the emphasis on materialism as more critics look for some form of spiritual dimension of texts. Many critics have also become uncomfortable with the implications of constructivist approaches to language, insisting that there is a world out there that language refers to. Eco-criticism is a particularly good example of this last trend, which is one reason why I included a reading about it for this week. Additionally, it is possibly the trendiest approach that I'm discussing in this video. The eco stands for ecological, and in its most basic terms, you might assume that it does for literature and the environment what, say, feminism does for literature and women. It looks at how literature represents the environment and affects our perceptions and actions in relation to the environment. However, an important difference between eco-criticism and other mimetic criticisms we've discussed in the last few weeks is that it is not an ideological criticism. It rejects constructivism and typically argues that nature is an actual physical thing that affects us, and how we imagine it affects how we interact with it. Berry illustrates this difference with the example of how eco-critics deal with simplistic binary oppositions like country versus city or nature versus culture. Deconstruction would proceed by showing the binary was false in order to destabilize language. It might say, parts of nature are actually part of culture and vice versa, therefore the distinction is artificial and socially constructed. Eco-critics instead maintain that the distinction is meaningful, but they question the binary as being too simple. Instead, they see nature and culture as a series of overlapping states that could be divided into 4 areas: the wilderness, desert, oceans, uninhabited continents; the scenic sublime, forests, lakes, mountains; the countryside, hills and fields; and the domestic picturesque, parks and gardens. Note that these come progressively closer to human civilization until the final zone actually overlaps it. I'm not going to review everything Berry says about eco-criticism, that's why I had you read the chapter, but let's review what their methodology looks like and look quickly at his example. First, eco-critics read literary texts to look at how they represent the natural world. Then they apply concepts from the study of ecology to things not necessarily in the natural world to show how the text configures our understanding of those concepts. Berry lists things like growth and energy, balance and imbalance, symbiosis and mutuality, sustainable and unsustainable uses of energy as possible subjects here. His example reading comes from Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher. A typical reading of the story would focus on how Usher's house is a metaphor for a human mind, and the collapse of the house at the end represents a collapse into madness. An ecocentric reading would look instead at the representation of the house itself and its environment. Note again that this takes the environment literally rather than simply seeing it as socially constructed. Berry's reading finds that the description of the house emphasizes how the house is an isolated, entropic system which has no connections at all with the broader biosphere. As a result, in this reading, the story isn't about an individual collapse into madness, but about ecological disaster when ecosystems aren't integrated with each other. We might also note that this reading seems to be projecting contemporary concerns onto the text, rather than trying to read Poe's intentions in writing the text. So consider how that draws from some of the assumptions I listed earlier that come from previous literary theory. The text makes meaning in ways that go beyond authorial intention. Moving on from eco-criticism, we find another critical approach that takes this last feature to the extreme: presentism. Presentism might remind us of New Historicism or Marxism, in that it tends to look at parallels between the discourse found in a literary text and the discourse found in a non-literary cultural text. The difference, though, is that presentism isn't concerned with looking at the links between the text and the cultural context that produced it. A presentist might look at how Shakespeare's plays, say, comment on the cultural and global terrorism of today. Obviously, the discourse of terrorism is not something that formed Shakespeare's plays, and it couldn't possibly be part of Shakespeare's intentions. However, presentists, like reader response, are more concerned with how texts speak to audiences than what the intended meaning of the text is. Shakespeare is still read and performed more than any other contemporary dramatist, so how his plays affect our understanding of contemporary concerns actually has tremendous significance. For my next two examples, I want to highlight another feature of contemporary theory that Berry discusses, its greater focus on empirical evidence. Stylistics is an approach to literary criticism that draws heavily on the more scientific area of linguistics. The goal of stylistics is to provide hard data to confirm our intuitive understandings of how literary texts make meaning. For instance, it is commonplace to describe Ernest Hemingway's style as simple or minimalist. Stylistics would attempt to describe what this means by looking at the technical features of language, syntax, grammar, transitivity, etc. Such readings often include a lot of counting and statistics, something like, only 10% of the nouns in that story include any adjectives qualifying them, rather than, Hemingway's style is simple and non-descriptive. Ultimately, the goal here might remind us of structuralism. Stylistics wants to find general rules about how language makes meaning, but they support these conclusions with statistics and extremely detailed close readings. Similarly, cognitive studies attempts to take a more scientific approach, in this case by taking the insights of cognitive science about how the brain works and applying it to literature. This might remind us a bit of reader response, with the goal being to see how the brain processes literature and how the structures of literary writing are formed in order to take advantage of or work against the way the brain usually processes information. Note that cognitivist readings are less interested in interpretation than in, as Berry puts it, mapping the mechanisms of the cognitive processes involved. This can sometimes just be a tedious explication of the cognitive processes involved, but it can also be an interesting insight into why certain textual structures work as they do. A good example of cognitive studies applied to literature can be found in Shakespeare's Brain by Mary Thomas Crane. Here's an excerpt from the publisher's description of the book. Quote, "Here Mary Thomas Crane considers the brain as a site where body and culture meet to form the subject and its expression in language. Taking Shakespeare as her case study, she boldly demonstrates the explanatory power of cognitive theory, a theory which argues that language is produced by a reciprocal interaction of body and environment, brain and culture, and which refocuses attention on the role of the author in the making of meaning. Crane reveals in Shakespeare's texts a web of structures and categories through which meaning is created. The approach yields fresh insights into a wide range of his plays. Oddly enough, this may also remind us of the pre-theory old historicism, in that Crane claims that a literary text in a way allows us to reconstruct how the author's brain functioned. This would seem to lead us full circle with theory, back to where we started. And to complete that circuit, I want to end with an approach sometimes called new aestheticism or new formalism. There are critics who want to move away from the focus on ideological readings and back to the emphasis on form, often arguing that theory generalizes too much about texts and tends to produce repetitious readings because we go into a text seeing what we expect to see. Instead of asking whether a text supports or opposes ideology, we should look at each text on its own terms to see how it interacts in complex and sometimes contradictory ways with the social forms of its time. However, this isn't just a naive return to formalism. New formalism is very attentive to the social and political consequences of texts and doesn't simply perform close readings in a vacuum. In terms of reading method, new formalism typically performs detailed close readings, giving attention to form, grammar, and syntax in a way that might remind us of effective stylistics from reader response, or stylistics as discussed above. The goal of these readings is to show interaction between literary form and other social forms. I had you read the first chapter of Carolyn Levine's Forms as an example of new formalism for today. Note that she positions her argument in contrast to deconstruction and ideological theories by emphasizing form, but that she also positions herself in contrast to the new critics by arguing for the political consequences of form, and even arguing against the heresy of paraphrase, as her reading method in this book looks at the form of plots on a large scale and thus involves quite a bit of plot summary. Ultimately, Levine's argument is that we find forms all over the place, not only in literature, but in society in general. Political systems are social forms. Economic systems are social forms. Literary critics should apply their training in reading for form to all sorts of forms, and we should pay attention to the collision in texts between literary forms and the social forms they represent. To use Levine's words, quote, "The new criticism with its interest in the differences between forms can actually point the way forward here, inviting us to develop a richer and more precise terminology for the work of social forms. And if it is a challenge to identify and analyze the shaping elements of a single sonnet, then it is certainly impossible to capture the patterns constitutive of an entire society with a handful of categories, such as race, class, gender, nationality, sexuality, and disability. It is time to export those practices, to take our traditional skills to new objects, the social structures and institutions that are among the most crucial sites of political efficacy." Ultimately, I think this is a good place to end the literary theory portion of this class, because Levine's argument suggests exciting possibilities for how the best features of our discipline, close reading, critical thinking, and careful attention to texts, can be integrated with social consciousness and a broad range of significant issues.